The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniel wiped down another table at the community center. His shift didn't officially start for another hour, but he'd come early with his mom. She needed help carrying the heavy catering trays from their beat-up Honda, and Daniel never said no when his mom needed him. At 17, Daniel had gotten pretty good at being invisible. In a place like this where everyone wore clothes that cost more than his monthly grocery budget, being invisible was a survival skill. He kept his head down, his hands busy, and tried not to think about the world of difference between his life and the lives of the people who'd be filling this hall in about an hour. But then he saw it. The piano sat in the center of the stage like a sleeping giant. The overhead lights made it gleam, all black and perfect and impossibly beautiful. Daniel had seen pianos before, of course, in movies and music videos, through the windows of the fancy music store downtown that he'd never dare to enter. But he'd never been this close to one, never been in the same room with one, breathing the same air. Something tugged at his chest. It was the same feeling he got sometimes late at night, when he'd lie in bed with his phone pressed to his ear, volume turned down low so he wouldn't wake his mom in the next room. He'd listen to piano music until his battery died, memorizing every note, every pause, every breath between the melodies. His mom always said he had a weird obsession with piano music. She'd find him watching videos of piano performances during his lunch break at school, or humming complicated classical pieces while he washed dishes at the Chinese restaurant where he worked weekends. She didn't understand it, not really. How could she? They'd never had money for music lessons. They barely had money for rent. Daniel's feet moved before his brain caught up. One step, then another, until he was climbing the 3 stairs to the stage. His heart hammered in his chest. This was stupid. This was so incredibly stupid. But his hands were itching and his fingers were twitching, and something deep inside him was screaming that he needed to touch those keys just once in his life. The bench was cooler than he expected when he sat down. Smooth and firm and perfect. He stared at the keys, all those black and white rectangles arranged in a pattern he'd memorized years ago from a picture in a library book. He'd drawn this pattern on cardboard once, cut out the keys and practiced finger positions in his bedroom, until his mom told him he was being ridiculous. But he wasn't being ridiculous. He knew he wasn't. Because when he looked at those keys, he didn't just see black and white. He saw music. He heard it, felt it, lived it in a way he couldn't explain to anyone. His right hand lifted, fingers trembling. He was actually going to do this. He was actually going to, "Hey!" Who led him near the piano? The voice cracked through the air like a whip. Daniel's hand froze 6 inches above the keys. His stomach dropped straight through the floor. A woman in a red dress was power-walking toward the stage, her face twisted in horror like Daniel had just pulled out a knife. Behind her, a security guard in a dark uniform started moving too, speaking into his radio. Daniel shot to his feet so fast the bench scraped backward with an awful screech. His face burned hot enough to start a fire. I'm so sorry, I wasn't going to." "That instrument is worth more than a car," the woman snapped. She'd reached the stage now, slightly out of breath. Her name tag read Event Coordinator. "It's a Steinway. Do you have any idea how much damage can be done by inexperienced hands?" "I know, I'm sorry, Daniel's voice cracked. He hated how young he sounded, how small. He was backing away from the piano like it might explode. "I wasn't thinking." The security guard had reached the stage too. "Son, I'm going to need you to come with me." This was it. They were going to kick him out, probably ban him from ever coming back, maybe even get his mom fired from her catering job. All because he couldn't control himself around a stupid piano. Tears pricked at his eyes and he blinked them back furiously. He would not cry, not here, not in front of these people. Wait. The voice was quiet, but it carried. An old man was making his way through the small crowd that had gathered, curious about the commotion. He walked with a cane but didn't lean on it much. His suit probably cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe, but his eyes were kind. "Wait," the old man said again, reaching the stage. He looked at the woman in the red dress. "Margaret, isn't this supposed to be a charity event?" Margaret's face flushed. "Yes, Mr. Harrison, but..." "And isn't the charity for underprivileged youth? Music education programs?" "Well, yes, but..." "Then perhaps we should let this young man sit." Mr. Harrison turned to Daniel and his expression was gentle. "You wanted to play?" Daniel couldn't find his voice. He just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Have you had lessons?" Daniel shook his head. "But you know piano music?" This time Daniel managed to whisper. I listen to it. All the time. I've memorized. I know a lot of pieces. In my head, I mean. Something flickered in Mr. Harrison's eyes. Interest, maybe, or pity. Daniel couldn't tell which would be worse. Margaret, Mr. Harrison said, still looking at Daniel. This is my event, correct? My donation pays for this hall, this piano, this entire evening? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, sir. Then I'd like to exercise my right as benefactor to let this young man play. Just one piece. What harm could it do? But sir, the piano can be tuned if necessary. I'll pay for it myself. Mr. Harrison gestured to the bench. Sit, son. Play something for us. Daniel's legs felt like water. The crowd had grown now. Maybe 20 people clustered around the stage, all watching him. Some looked amused, like they were about to witness a car crash. Others looked annoyed at the delay. A few looked genuinely curious. His mom had appeared from somewhere in the back, her catering uniform crisp and white, her face pale with worry. She shook her head slightly, a tiny movement that said, "Don't. Just apologize and come help me in the kitchen." But Mr. Harrison was waiting. The piano was waiting, and Daniel's entire body was screaming at him to sit down, to touch those keys, to finally let out everything he'd been holding inside for years. He sat. The world seemed to shrink down to just him and the piano. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold them steady. He'd never done this before, never actually touched a real piano. What if he was wrong? What if all those hours of listening, of memorizing, of practicing on cardboard cutouts meant nothing when faced with the real thing? What if he was about to humiliate himself in front of all these people? Daniel took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let his fingers find the keys. They felt cool under his touch, smooth, real, more real than anything he'd ever experienced. For a second he just rested his hands there, feeling the impossible reality that he was actually doing this. In his mind, the music started playing, not from his fingers yet, but from somewhere deep inside his chest. He'd listened to this piece hundreds of times. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, third movement. People said it was difficult, but Daniel didn't care about that. He only cared that it was the piece that had saved him during the darkest months of his life. His fingers pressed down, and the first notes sang out. The sound was nothing like his phone speakers. It was alive. It vibrated through his bones, through the bench, through the floor. The second note followed the first. Then the third. And then Daniel stopped thinking entirely and just played. The first chord rolled out of the piano like thunder, and Daniel felt his whole body come alive. His fingers knew where to go. They just knew. All those nights lying in bed, tracing the patterns in the air above his chest. All those hours watching videos with the screen brightness turned down to save battery. All those moments when he'd close his eyes and imagine his hands dancing across keys he thought he'd never touch. It all came flooding back, the music poured out of him. Fast, furious, desperate. This wasn't the gentle beginning of the Moonlight Sonata. This was the third movement, the part that sounded like a storm breaking, like everything beautiful and terrible in the world happening all at once. His left hand was doing things he'd only imagined, hitting bass notes that made the floor vibrate, while his right hand flew across the higher keys so fast it felt like flying. He'd memorized this piece note by note, measure by measure, sitting in the back of the city bus on his way to his evening shift at the restaurant. He'd listened to it so many times that he could hear it in his sleep, could hum every single part even when his phone was dead and he had nothing but silence around him. But hearing it and playing it were two completely different things. The piano responded to every touch. When he pressed harder, the sound swelled and filled the entire hall. When he lightened his touch, the notes became soft, almost fragile, like they might break if he wasn't careful. It was like the piano was talking back to him, having a conversation, telling him secrets that only the two of them could understand. Daniel had no idea if he was doing it right. He'd never had a teacher to tell him his posture was wrong or his fingering was off. He was just doing what felt natural, what his body told him to do, what the music demanded. His foot found the pedals without him thinking about it, and suddenly the sounds were blending together, creating layers that made his heart want to explode. Around him, the world had gone completely silent. He'd forgotten about the crowd, forgotten about Margaret in her red dress and the security guard and even Mr. Harrison who'd given him this chance. He'd forgotten about his mom watching from somewhere in the back, probably holding her breath, probably praying he wouldn't embarrass them both. He'd forgotten that he was sitting on a stage in his cheap jacket and worn-out sneakers, surrounded by people who lived in a different universe than he did. There was only the music. His fingers stumbled on a particularly fast run, and for a split second panic shot through him. He'd messed up. He'd actually messed up. But his hands kept moving, adjusting, finding their way back to the melody like they had a mind of their own. The mistake was so quick that Daniel wasn't even sure anyone else had heard it. And then he was back in the flow, back in the storm, letting the music carry him wherever it wanted to go. Sweat was starting to form on his forehead. His arms were beginning to ache. This piece was a workout, demanding everything from him, pushing him to move faster than he'd ever moved, to think faster than he'd ever thought. But he didn't want to stop. He couldn't stop, not now, not when he was finally doing the thing he'd dreamed about for years. The music built and built, climbing toward something huge, something that felt bigger than Daniel himself. His whole body was involved now, leaning into the piano, rocking slightly with the rhythm, becoming part of the instrument. This was what those pianists in the videos had looked like, the ones he'd studied so carefully, trying to understand not just what their fingers were doing, but how their entire bodies moved with the music. And then came the part he'd been both anticipating and dreading. The impossible part. The section where both hands had to move in different patterns at speeds that seemed superhuman, where one tiny mistake could derail the entire thing. He'd listened to this part 1,000 times, had practiced it on his cardboard keyboard until the cardboard wore thin and started to tear. His hands flew across the keys, left hand thundering in the bass, right hand dancing in the treble, both working together but independently, creating a sound so full and rich that it seemed impossible it was coming from just one person. Time stretched out. Seconds felt like hours. His brain was operating on a level he didn't know existed, processing information faster than conscious thought, letting muscle memory and instinct take over. He hit a wrong note. A clear, obvious wrong note that clanged out like a bell. His stomach lurched. But there was no time to dwell on it, no time to even feel embarrassed. The music was already moving forward, already demanding he keep up, and Daniel pushed through, his fingers finding their way back to the right path. The crowd was still silent. Daniel couldn't see them anymore, even though his eyes were open now, staring at the keys without really seeing them. He was somewhere else, somewhere between the real world and the world the music was creating, suspended in a space where nothing else mattered except the next note and the next. And the next, his mother had asked him once why he loved piano music so much. What was it about those sounds that made him so obsessed? Daniel hadn't been able to explain it then, hadn't had the words. But now, sitting at this piano, feeling the vibrations travel through his body, hearing the notes fill the air around him, he understood. Piano music was every emotion he'd never been able to express. It was the sadness of watching his mom work herself to exhaustion. It was the anger of being invisible in a world that only saw people with money. It was the hope that somehow, someday, things might be different. It was everything he was and everything he wanted to be, all translated into sound. The piece was racing toward its conclusion now. The final sprint, the part where everything came together in one last explosive burst of energy. Before it all ended, Daniel's arms were screaming at him, his fingers starting to feel numb, but he pushed harder. This was it. This was his one shot, his one moment to prove that all those years of dreaming hadn't been wasted. The final measures flew by in a blur. Complex chords, racing scales, both hands moving in perfect synchronization even though they'd never practiced together on an actual piano. It was chaos and order at the same time, beautiful and violent, everything and nothing all at once, and then suddenly, it was over. Daniel's hands crashed down on the final chord, holding it, letting it ring out into the hall, letting the sound fill every corner of the space before it slowly faded away into nothing. The silence that followed was so complete that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He sat frozen, his hand still on the keys, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Sweat dripped down the side of his face. His fingers were shaking. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd played a real piano for the first time in his life, and he'd made it all the way through one of the hardest pieces he knew. But now came the terrifying part. Now he had to face the crowd and find out what they thought. Find out if he'd just made a complete fool of himself in front of all these people. Slowly, Daniel lifted his hands from the keys. Slowly, he turned his head toward the audience, What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Every single person was staring at him. Their faces were frozen in expressions he couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, disbelief. Some people had their mouths slightly open. Others were completely still, like statues. Nobody was moving. Nobody was speaking. The silence stretched on, and with each passing second, Daniel's heart sank deeper. He'd messed it up. All those wrong notes, all that imperfect technique had been worse than he thought. Then someone started clapping. It was Mr. Harrison. The old man was on his feet, his cane forgotten beside his chair, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the silent hall. His eyes were wet, actual tears running down his weathered cheeks, and he was smiling like he'd just witnessed something miraculous. And then, like a dam breaking, everyone else started clapping too. The sound hit Daniel like a physical force. It wasn't polite charity event applause. It was thunderous. People were standing up one after another until the entire crowd was on their feet. The security guard who'd tried to remove him was clapping. Margaret in her red dress was clapping, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. Even the catering staff had appeared from the kitchen, his mom among them, and they were all clapping too. Daniel sat frozen on the piano bench, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of dream. Or maybe he'd passed out from nervousness and this was all happening in his unconscious mind, while his actual body was sprawled out on the stage floor. But the applause kept going. It got louder, if that was even possible. Someone whistled. Someone else shouted, "Bravo!" like they were at an opera or something. A woman in the front row was actually crying, dabbing at her eyes with a fancy handkerchief. Mr. Harrison made his way up to the stage, moving faster than Daniel would have thought possible for someone his age. He reached Daniel and put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." Daniel's voice came out as a croak. "I made mistakes. I hit wrong notes." "Wrong notes?" Mr. Harrison laughed, a sound full of genuine joy. "My boy, I've been attending piano performances for 60 years. I've heard professionals, masters, virtuosos from around the world. And I've never heard anyone play with that much raw feeling, that much heart." He paused, studying Daniel's face. "How long have you been playing?" This was the question Daniel had been dreading. The one that would make everyone realize he was a fraud, that he had no business being anywhere near this piano. He looked down at his hands, still trembling in his lap. That was my first time," the applause faltered, then stopped completely. The silence came rushing back, but it was different now, heavier, charged with something Daniel couldn't name. "I'm sorry," Mr. Harrison said slowly. "I don't think I heard you correctly. Your first time performing?" "My first time touching a piano." Daniel's face burned. "I've never had lessons. Never even sat at a piano before tonight. I listen to music a lot, and I memorize it, and I practice the finger movements in the air, and He trailed off, realizing how insane he sounded. Margaret had climbed onto the stage now, her expression suspicious. "That's not possible. Nobody plays like that without training, without years of training." "It's true." His mom's voice cut through the crowd. She pushed forward, still in her catering uniform, her face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "He's telling the truth. We've never had money for lessons. We don't even own a keyboard. He does this thing where he watches videos on his phone and traces patterns in the air. I always thought he was just, I don't know, daydreaming." The crowd erupted in whispers. People were pulling out their phones, already texting or recording or whatever people did when something unusual happened. Daniel wanted to disappear into the floor. This was worse than being kicked out. This was being turned into some kind of spectacle. "Let me get this straight," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "You're claiming you just played one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire, from memory, without ever having touched a piano before?" "I'm not claiming anything," Daniel said quietly. "I'm just telling you what happened. It's impossible." "Clearly it's not," Mr. Harrison interjected, "because we all just heard it." He turned to Daniel. "Play something else. Something different." Daniel's stomach twisted. Please. If what you're saying is true, then you can do it again. Pick any piece you know. Play it for us." The crowd had gone quiet again, waiting. Daniel looked at his mom, who gave him a tiny nod. What else could he do? He was already here, already exposed. Might as well go all the way. He turned back to the piano. His fingers were still shaking, but he placed them on the keys anyway. This time he chose something gentler, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. He'd discovered it during a particularly rough week last winter, when the heating in their apartment had broken and they'd had to sleep wearing every piece of clothing they owned. The piece had been like a warm blanket when he had none. The notes flowed out soft and lyrical. So different from the storm of Beethoven. This was water instead of fire, moonlight instead of lightning. Daniel let himself sink into it. Let the melody wrap around him like a familiar friend. He wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. Wasn't thinking about anything except the music and the way it made him feel less alone. When he finished, the silence lasted only a heartbeat before the applause started again. But this time Mr. Harrison raised his hand for quiet. "I believe you," he said simply. "I don't understand it, but I believe you." He looked out at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've just witnessed something remarkable. Something that happens maybe once in a generation." He turned back to Daniel. "What's your name, son?" "Daniel. Daniel Webb." "Well, Daniel Webb, how would you feel about a scholarship?" Daniel blinked. "A what?" "I'm on the board of the Riverside Music Conservatory. We provide full scholarships to exceptional students who show promise. And you, my boy, have more than promise. You have something I can't even put into words." Mr. Harrison pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the director right now. Tonight I want him to hear you play." "But Daniel's head was spinning. "I don't have any formal training. I don't know music theory or how to read sheet music or... You can learn all of that. What you have, what you demonstrated tonight, can't be taught. It's a gift." Mr. Harrison was already dialing. "The scholarship covers everything. Tuition, room and board, a living stipend. Your mother won't have to work 3 jobs anymore." Daniel's mom made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She was definitely crying now, not even trying to hide it. "Why?" Daniel asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Mr. Harrison looked at him with those kind, watery eyes. "Because 40 years ago I was a young man who loved music but couldn't afford lessons. Someone gave me a chance and it changed my entire life. I've been waiting for an opportunity to pay that forward." He smiled. "And I don't think I'm going to find a better opportunity than you." The next hour passed in a blur. The director of the conservatory actually came to the community center, leaving his own dinner party to hear Daniel play. Daniel performed 3 more pieces, his confidence growing with each one. People were taking videos. Someone said something about social media. Margaret had completely transformed from suspicious to enthusiastic, already talking about how she'd discovered him, conveniently forgetting that she'd tried to kick him out. But through it all, Daniel kept looking at the piano. This beautiful, impossible instrument that had somehow known exactly what he needed it to do. That had responded to his touch like it had been waiting for him his whole life. When the crowd finally started to disperse, when the contracts were signed and the phone numbers exchanged and the promises made, Daniel found himself alone on the stage one more time. His mom was in the back talking to Mr. Harrison about logistics. The conservatory director was making phone calls about enrollment. Daniel sat at the piano again, touched the keys gently, reverently. A few hours ago he'd been invisible. Just another poor kid from the wrong side of town, going nowhere, doing nothing, dreaming impossible dreams. Now everything had changed, and it all started because he couldn't resist the pull of this instrument. 3 months later, Daniel stood in front of a practice room at the Riverside Music Conservatory, staring at the placard on the door that read Studio 12B. His studio, his practice room. The words still didn't feel real. Inside was a beautiful upright piano, not as grand as the Steinway from that night, but perfect in its own way. The room had soundproofing on the walls, a comfortable bench, even a small desk for studying theory. Daniel had cried the first time he'd seen it, but the transition hadn't been easy, not even close. Daniel pushed open the door and sat at the piano, flexing his fingers. They were sore, covered in small calluses that hadn't been there before. Playing piano for hours every day was physically demanding in ways he'd never imagined. His back hurt from posture corrections. His wrists ached from technique exercises. And his pride had taken a beating too. "You're doing it wrong." That had been Professor Chen's first words to him, barely 5 minutes into his first real lesson. "Everything you're doing is wrong." Daniel had felt his stomach drop. "But you played beautifully, yes. Emotionally, musically, you're extraordinary. But technically?" Professor Chen had shaken her head. You've taught yourself bad habits that will cause injury if we don't correct them. Your posture will give you chronic pain. Your fingering is inefficient. Your pedal technique is sloppy. We have to rebuild everything from the ground up. It had been humiliating. Here he was, the boy who'd amazed everyone at that charity event, being told he was doing everything wrong. The other students whispered about him in the halls. Some were curious, friendly even. Others were resentful. Learning to read sheet music had been its own special torture. Daniel could hear a piece once and play it back, but ask him to read those little dots and lines on paper and his brain turned to mush. It was like learning a foreign language, except everyone else here had been speaking it since they were 5 years old. His music theory class was even worse. The professor would write things on the board and Daniel would sit there feeling lost. His classmates would nod knowingly, scribbling notes, while Daniel tried to figure out what any of it meant. After class, he'd spend hours in the library trying to understand, watching tutorial videos on his phone, reading textbook chapters until his eyes burned. The practice rooms were his refuge. Here, alone with the piano, he could just play. He could forget about theory and sight reading and just feel the music. But even that was changing. Now when he played, he heard Professor Chen's voice in his head. Curved fingers. Weight from your arm. Don't pound the keys. Daniel placed his hands on the keys and started running through his scales. C major, G major, D major. Basic exercises, the kind 6-year-olds did in their first month of lessons. But Professor Chen had insisted, "We fix it now or you'll never reach your full potential." The door opened behind him. Daniel's hands froze mid-scale. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. It was Tyler, one of his classmates, a piano prodigy who'd been training since he was 3, who could sight read anything. He was exactly the kind of person who should have resented Daniel, but he'd been nothing but kind. "It's okay," Daniel said, moving to stand up. "You need the room?" No. I was actually looking for you." Tyler came in and closed the door behind him. "Look, I know you're having a rough time with theory." Daniel's face heated up. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I sit behind you in class. I can see you're struggling." Tyler pulled up the desk chair and sat down. "And I wanted to say, for what it's worth, I think Professor Anderson is teaching it all wrong. He assumes everyone comes in with the same foundation, but you don't learn the same way we do." "You mean I'm behind?" "I mean you learn by hearing and feeling, not by seeing and analyzing. That's not better or worse. It's just different." Tyler pulled out his phone. "Can I show you something?" He pulled up a video and turned the screen toward Daniel. It was a documentary clip about a famous jazz pianist from the 1960s. This guy, he couldn't read music either. Not at first. Some people said he never really learned properly. But he became one of the greatest jazz pianists who ever lived because he understood music in a different way. He felt it. Daniel watched the video, something tight in his chest loosening just slightly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you look like you're about to quit." "And that would be a tragedy." Tyler pocketed his phone. "I've been playing piano my whole life. I can read music in my sleep. I know theory inside and out. And you know what? When you played at that charity event, the video that's been going around, I watched it and I cried. Actually cried. Because I've never made anyone feel something that deeply with my playing. Maybe I never will." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. "The thing is," Tyler continued, "you have something special, something rare. Yeah? You need to learn the technical stuff, the theory, the proper technique. That's just the price of admission. But don't let it kill what makes you special. Don't let Professor Chen's corrections make you forget why you play in the first place." After Tyler left, Daniel sat at the piano for a long time, thinking. Then he started to play, not scales this time, not exercises. He played the Chopin Nocturne from that night, the one that had felt like a warm blanket. But this time he tried to incorporate what he'd learned. Curved fingers, proper posture, smoother pedaling. It was harder this way, more conscious, less instinctive. But as he played, something started to click. The technique wasn't there to restrict him. It was there to give him more tools, more ways to express what he was feeling. It was like learning bigger words so he could say more complex things. The piece sounded different now. Still emotional, still heartfelt, but clearer somehow. Cleaner. More controlled in a way that actually made the emotional parts hit harder. When he finished, Daniel sat back and smiled. Maybe this was going to work after all. His phone buzzed. A text from his mom. "How's my concert pianist doing?" Daniel typed back, "Learning. It's hard, but I'm okay," and he was. It wasn't easy. It wasn't what he'd imagined, this fairy tale transformation from nobody to somebody. The reality was messy and frustrating and full of moments where he felt completely inadequate. But he was learning, growing, becoming something more than what he'd been. There was a knock on the door. Professor Chen poked her head in. "Daniel, do you have a moment?" His stomach tightened. Had he done something wrong? Fallen too far behind? "Yes, Professor." She came in and closed the door, her expression serious. Daniel braced himself for bad news. "I wanted to talk to you about the winter showcase," she said. "It's in 2 months. Every student performs a piece for the faculty and guest donors. It's a big deal." "Okay," Daniel said cautiously. "I'd like you to perform." She paused. "I know you're still working on fundamentals. I know you're behind in theory and sight reading. But the showcase isn't about technical perfection. It's about showing what you can do, where you're growing, and I think you're ready." Daniel's heart started pounding. "Really, really. We'll choose a piece that showcases your strengths while demonstrating the progress you've made. Something that lets you play with that remarkable musicality you have, while also showing the discipline you're learning." She smiled, and it was the first time Daniel had seen her smile at him. "You're doing better than you think, Daniel. Much better." After she left, Daniel put his head down on the piano keys, not caring that it made a discordant sound. Relief flooded through him. He was doing okay. He was actually doing okay. He had 2 months to prepare for his first real performance as a conservatory student. 2 months to prove that Mr. Harrison's faith in him hadn't been misplaced. 2 months to show everyone, including himself, that he belonged here. Daniel lifted his head and started to practice. This time, when he played his scales, they sounded like progress. The night of the winter showcase arrived faster than Daniel expected. He stood backstage in the conservatory's concert hall, wearing a suit that Mr. Harrison had bought him. It was the nicest thing Daniel had ever worn, and he kept tugging at the collar. Through the curtain, he could hear the audience settling in. The hall seated 300 people, and it was sold out. Faculty members, donors, parents, music critics. And somewhere out there, his mom was sitting in the 3rd row wearing a new dress she'd bought with her first paycheck from her new job. Mr. Harrison was out there too. He'd called Daniel last week to wish him luck and tell him he wouldn't miss this performance for anything. Daniel's hands were shaking. Not the nervous trembling from that first night. This was different. This was the weight of expectation. "You're on in 5 minutes." The stage manager appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. "You ready?" "No," Daniel thought. But he nodded anyway. Tyler appeared from somewhere in the wings. He'd already performed his piece, a technically perfect rendition of a Rachmaninoff prelude that had earned enthusiastic applause. "Hey," he said quietly, "you got this. What if I mess up?" Daniel whispered. "What if I freeze? What if my 3 months of training isn't enough and I embarrass everyone who believed in me?" "Then you mess up," Tyler said simply. "And you keep playing. That's all any of us can do." He squeezed Daniel's shoulder. "But you won't mess up. You know why? Because you're not playing for them. You're playing for you, just like that first night." The stage manager was waving him over. It was time. Daniel walked to the stage entrance, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The curtain was still down. On the other side, the audience had gone quiet, waiting. The piano sat center stage under a single spotlight, looking both beautiful and terrifying. Professor Chen appeared beside him. She'd been tough on him these past months, demanding, never satisfied. But now her expression was soft. "Daniel," she said, "remember something. You've worked harder in 3 months than some students work in 3 years. You've earned your place here." Daniel's eyes stung. He blinked rapidly. "Go show them what you can do," she said. "Not what they expect. What you can do." The curtain rose. The spotlight hit Daniel's eyes, and for a moment he was blind. Then his vision adjusted, and he could see them. Rows and rows of people, all watching him. He spotted his mom immediately. She was crying already, hand pressed to her mouth. Next to her sat Mr. Harrison, smiling that gentle smile. Daniel walked to the piano. His legs felt steady. That surprised him. He'd expected to shake, to feel like that scared teenager again. But he didn't. He felt different, stronger. He sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed his hands on the keys. The audience was completely silent, waiting. Daniel had chosen his piece carefully, working with Professor Chen to find something that showed both his natural musicality and his new technical skills. Liszt's Liebestraum No. 3, a piece about love and dreams and longing. A piece that demanded both emotion and precision. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and began. The opening notes floated out, soft and gentle. His curved fingers, his proper posture, all the things Professor Chen had drilled into him. But underneath the technique was still him. Still that boy who'd dreamed impossible dreams. The piece built slowly. Daniel could feel every note, could feel how the technique gave him more control. It was like having a bigger vocabulary. He could say more now. The middle section came, faster and more passionate. His hands moved across the keys with growing confidence. There were runs he'd practiced 1,000 times, passages that had seemed impossible until they weren't. He made a small mistake in a fast section. His left hand was late, but instead of panicking, Daniel breathed through it and kept going. Just like he'd learned in countless practice sessions, the piece swelled toward its climax, high delicate notes that required precision, combined with deep bass notes that needed power, but his hands knew what to do now. The hours of practice all came together in this moment. The music filled the hall. Daniel forgot about the audience, forgot everything except the conversation with this instrument. This was why he'd fallen in love with piano music. This connection. This feeling of expressing things words could never capture. The piece began its descent, growing softer, more tender. The passionate middle gave way to something gentler, like coming home. Daniel's touch lightened, each note carefully placed. This was where his natural musicality shone through. The final notes came soft as whispers, fading into silence. Daniel held the last chord, letting it ring out until it disappeared into the quiet. Then he lifted his hands from the keys. The silence lasted for 3, heartbeats 4, 5. Then the audience exploded. They were on their feet immediately, everyone at once. Applause crashing over Daniel like a wave. But this time it felt different. At the charity event, they'd been shocked by the novelty. Now they were applauding the music, the work. Daniel stood and bowed, and when he looked up, he saw his mom openly sobbing. Mr. Harrison was clapping so hard it looked like his hands must hurt. Professor Chen stood at the side of the stage, and she was smiling. Actually smiling. She nodded at him once, a small gesture that meant more than any words could. As Daniel walked off stage, the applause following him, he felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, though there was that too. Something deeper. A sense of belonging, of earning his place through sweat and struggle and refusing to give up when everything felt impossible. Tyler was waiting in the wings, grinning. "Told you," he said. Backstage, other students crowded around, offering congratulations. Some of the same students who'd whispered about him months ago, who'd questioned whether he deserved to be here, but their congratulations felt genuine now. He'd proven himself in the only way that mattered. Through the work. Later at the reception, Mr. Harrison pulled Daniel aside. "I knew that night at the charity event that you had something special," he said. "But what I saw tonight was different. You've become a real musician, Daniel, not just someone with raw talent. A real disciplined, trained musician, and you did it in 3 months. Do you know how remarkable that is?" Daniel shook his head, overwhelmed. "Most people would have quit," Mr. Harrison continued, "when they realized how hard it would be. When they discovered that natural ability wasn't enough, they would have walked away. But you didn't. You put in the work, and that more than any amount of talent is what will take you wherever you want to go." His mom hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "Not because you played beautifully, though you did. I'm proud because you didn't give up. Even when it was hard. Even when you wanted to." As Daniel stood there in his new suit, surrounded by people who believed in him, he thought about that scared 17-year-old who'd climbed onto a stage 3 months ago. Terrified and trembling, touching a piano for the first time. That boy had been hoping for a miracle, for his life to change in an instant. But real change didn't work that way. Real change came from showing up every day, from doing the hard work when nobody was watching, from being willing to be broken down and rebuilt. The miracle wasn't that night at the charity event. The miracle was what came after. The choice to keep going. Daniel looked down at his hands. The same hands that had traced patterns in the air above his bed, that had practiced on cardboard cutouts, that had finally finally touched real piano keys and discovered they could make music. But now those hands were stronger, more capable, trained. He had so much more to learn. Years of training ahead of him. More struggles, more mistakes, more moments of doubt. But tonight, standing in this hall with applause still echoing in his ears, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was meant to be.